was living in LA, and it was just getting kind of unmanageable for me financially to balance the books. But also I was like finally at a point where between like art and comics and things, I could pay my bills that way. So I was like, I can live anywhere, and moved out to the desert. And I don't know, it works on like a geologic time, which I think is really interesting.
As far as just how you pass the time or how you mark the time?
Kind of how you mark the time, and then also like Mother Nature kind of kicks your ass a little bit in this way, where like, first of all, it's like far more beautiful out there than anything you could ever like do or make. And then it's like ancient stones, and like you can see the path of the moon and all the stars and everything. And I'm like, oh, I feel like an animal on a planet instead of just kind of a cog, which I don't know, just for mental health stuff, it was like a big, let me like prioritize things that are important to me versus things that aren't.
Is that an inspirational feeling? It sounds like it's a little frustrating, this idea that you couldn't make anything as beautiful as the world around you.
It's just a good reminder.
Yeah.
Like, I guess that is a little frustrating, but it's also
you
pretty powerful. Yeah. It isn't discouraging in the way that I think saying it that way sounds. It's just a good reminder that like I'm part of something like humans are part of something larger, for sure. That the world includes a lot of non-human elements.
Yeah.
And I think that is like, it's important to keep in check, especially as we are in like this kind of era of environmental instability and collapse in some ways, and like to keep that in mind as part of my like working process, you know?
Is there a feeling that you've kind of gone off the grid in a way?
It's not as like, it's definitely a place where I have like community with humans too. Like there's a pretty vibrant queer community out in the desert, and when I first moved out there, I was like, okay, I'm going to try it out. I might be like some wild hermit or something. But the surprise was I'm actually a lot more social and better at being social living out there than I ever was when I lived in a city. I'm kind of an elusive animal in general, hard to find, but I'm more social than ever before living out there, which feels like a strange switcheroo or something.
There's something about just being a part of a giant sea of humanity that's just completely alienating in a strange way.
Yeah.
You're on the train, or you're walking down the street and you're surrounded by people, but like you're not going to say hi to your neighbor.
Right.
Which I know, I say it in such a way like it's a ridiculous thing to do, like, and people outside cities are like, what are you talking about? But like, yeah, everyone's got their head down. I don't know if Chicago is exactly like that. I mean, there's a little bit of a Midwestern sensibility there.
It was the difference between like in a city, my social life much more revolved around going to big group events and saying quick highs and hellos, but not getting into deeper conversations with very many people. And living rurally, I think just because there's a lot less I'm not obligated, but like a lot less big events, but like it's much more relationships are built on longer conversations is what I'm trying to say, like longer hangouts, it seems. And so it has really been a good like mental balance for me too. So
I'd like to at some point calculate how much of my time is devoted to small talk right now. When I'm going to interview somebody, I'm like, save it for the interview, that kind of thing.
Right.
But you and I were walking from the events and trying to find places, and it was just like, the weather's really nice, and oh yeah, my dog hated this weather, and I was like, oh, I met this woman who was talking about litter training her cat on the toilet or something, and I think cities are conducive to that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And like, I'm not great at small talk. And so I think that maybe I let it fail a lot. And so it feels like when, I'm spending a longer time with someone, and then you can kind of get into the meat of like, oh, like, what's your like squirreliest idea? And like, yeah.
Something somebody wouldn't offer up to you immediately until they kind of know you a little bit. And
you can actually like talk, and if it's not a public space, you can talk about somebody's feelings about something and like process things that they're going through more than at a party or event. Like I see people I know at the comics festival, I can't be like, oh, I heard you're like really struggling, but you're doing better maybe, or like, like there's no place in a big public space, I think, to really get into that kind of mode. Especially at a show like this. But I think, again, this happens when you live in the city, is you run into people once or twice a year. Yep. And the impulse is to be like, so what have you been up to for the last entire year? Right. Or to like think what someone's been up to because you can see them online or something. So it's good for art? It's great for art. I mean, like, it also has given me a lot more balance in my time to live out there, because it's, I work slow, and so I have enough time and enough focus out there to consistently make things. And
so you work more now?
I work more now, I think. Well, I work more and better. I get more done, whether or not I work more.
You're more efficient.
More efficient, more focused.
Okay.
And I don't know, it's always been like, when I make work, it seems like a process of like honing what I'm doing down to kind of a core idea of it, or like getting as close as I can to saying something that feels like sincere and true. Yeah, it just takes a little time and space for me to do that. So
I was reading an interview with you on the way here, and you had, described the work as being kind of a finished idea, which is interesting. Less of an experiment and more of like, here's the experiment having been processed.
Yeah, I mean, I think I work on things long enough that I'm like, and then time to present the conclusion. A little bit. Yeah. I mean, there's experiments within the process of it, but I was just talking about it a little earlier this morning. I almost start with like things I'm interested in drawing, or things that really animate my thought process, like things from the world, like a piece of architectural ornamentation, or maybe an idea about, in the past, I've like worked a lot with like paradoxes within transgender identity and acceptance, like bodily acceptance.
It kind of reminds me of, when people talk about writing a song and they're like, I heard a phrase or something and that kickstarted it. So there's one aspect of it that's really visual and one aspect of it that's more just kind of ideological.
Yeah, it's like usually combining, like figuring out why an image will get me thinking about an idea and how what is in that, what parallels in that relationship, and then almost building my images out of like, not like a image salad or something that makes like tasty sense,
like a collage, or
almost like
juxtaposing ideas. And
when I started doing kind of more architectural paintings, I started when I was living in Chicago, and it was really putting together a lot of the architectural elements of Chicago, because the buildings there are this combination of very fancy and also falling apart in kind of a fancy way. And just this like repurposing of a structure seemed, or like, not necessarily repurposing, but doing what you can with what you've got seemed very an intrinsic notion to queer culture, especially in that city, but all over as well. Just the resourcefulness of queer establishments, and then also like queer communities. I felt like using these architectural elements, and also like, just like weird elements of Chicago buildings to make these structures, made them kind of ecstatic and also kind of speak to what I was trying to get at with the...
Doing what you have with what you've got, I mean, I guess that sort of speaks to body image too.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely speaks to like, I don't know, my experience of being trans in the world too, like where, to what degree like society will accept you, and to what degree that, you occupy space, I feel like I was working around drawings that were almost becoming too the conversation in my head was too circular and too paradoxical, and I was like, oh, this is very frustrating. And I don't know, I've started painting paintings that are just more directly about the body, still using kind of this ecstatic architecture I've been working on, and those feel a lot more joyous to me in this way, where they're still like, they still take the time, but they feel less like thwarted. Like I was doing a lot where I was like, oh, this like architecture almost like unbuilds itself. And a lot more it's working towards a place where I'm like, oh, I'm using this to like figure out how a body works and looks.
Do you feel like you're more drawn to narrative? I mean, in the form of comics versus doing a painting?
Not more or less, but I do feel both. Like I feel like when I have an idea, I know whether it will work as a painting or as a narrative. Like I think the comics narrative is so important because it can wind around in places almost like a film or an experimental film could. It can get at little angles that maybe a singular image of a painting can't.
When you're doing a painting, when it's just a single picture, most of the time you're asking the viewer to do a lot more of the heavy lifting, right?
A little bit. Maybe a lot more like contemplating.
Or interpreting something, versus obviously like comics are open to interpretation, but you're really taking them on a specific journey. Yeah,
and that's part of putting like all the details in the painting work I do is I almost want it to be like a riddle for the viewer, whereas like in a narrative I almost see it as being like a ride for the reader to go on.
Do you feel like there are periods in your life when you're more focused on one form than the other?
Yeah, and there are definitely periods where I think I definitely get to places where I'm like, oh, I just like make the same thing over and over again. And then I'm like, oh, I have to like switch. In order to switch it up, I often like switch
Switch the medium.
Yeah,
form,
exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think that's part of the reason years ago I stopped drawing. Like the book of Gaylord Phoenix came out and I stopped drawing it. And I was just like, that seems like a good closing point. Because everything else I draw after that seems like a repeat of this formula.
That was a closing point for comics for a while?
For comics for a while, but explicitly for the Gaylord Phoenix series. And then in the past couple of years, I've put out 2 new issues just because it seems like the context for that series, or like the fantasy world I imagine it occupying, enough in this world has changed that world has changed. And I'm like, oh, let's brush that character off. And
what's the relationship between the two?
I mean, I think they're dealing with like kind of like a similar shakeup, like a political uncertainty, environmental uncertainty, and just like kind of toxic forces from the world being a major destabilizing factor in all areas of like. I
mean, the last 10 years with regards to the kind of progress it seemed like we were making.
Yeah.
And then just sort of slamming headlong into a brick wall.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then like, there's like wake up call elements to that to be like, oh, there's like the work is constant, but there's, in general, it's just the worst. It's the pits. Maybe not the, like it can always get worse. So I'm hesitant to say like it's the worst, but yeah, it definitely like seemed like time. It seemed like in comparison to what the world is doing now, it seemed like the character of Gaylord Phoenix could do new things because that world has changed too and kind of mirrors ours.
So you went from the 3rd largest city in the country to the 2nd largest city in the country.
Yep.
And then you got priced out, which happens, especially in places like Los Angeles or New York or Chicago. There were a lot of options for places to go that are cheaper than Los Angeles. Was part of moving to the desert just kind of getting away from things for a bit?
I think part of it was seeing what I'd never not lived in a city or near a city. And so I think part of it was trying to live a little more rurally. And then, I don't know, it wasn't like an escape plan. I wasn't like, I need to get away. Yeah. But I think I needed to maybe live somewhere where I could feel a little more feral.
I'm from California originally. Went to school in Santa Cruz.
Oh, yeah.
I'd been living out here for a year or two. And the first time I went back home to the Bay Area and then visit Santa Cruz. It sounds so silly, but I was staying outside and I was like, oh, yeah, I don't think I've been in darkness for a long time or silence. We were setting up the equipment and this excavation was happening across the street and there's cars and you live in it long enough, you stop noticing these things.
Absolutely.
But you get out of it and you're like, oh, I'm never fully at peace.
Well, also, like, I feel like now every time I, like, step off an airplane in a new city, I'm like, oh my god, I feel like a bumpkin. Because, like, everything is super duper loud. And, like, I really feel it for the first couple of hours.
So you fully adapted to desert life.
I guess so. Yeah, I've got, like, I love hot weather, which it has in...
in the desert, yeah.
Yep, that happens. And I'm not, like, a water baby, so not being around much, like, swimming holes is fine by me. Yeah. I don't know. There's some things that I miss. It's not very bikeable out where I'm at. So I miss riding bikes. I also miss, and I didn't think I would miss this so much, but I miss like in the streets protest culture in cities, which I think is really important in terms of like psychic nourishment, and it's the kind of thing where I'm like, oh, I'm not always sure that like a big in the streets protest gets the most done right now and where we're at, but
it's hopeful.
It's hopeful. And it does do something. And I didn't realize I would miss it until I moved out rurally, and it just doesn't happen like that there, or at least not yet. So, but I don't know. Those are the 2 big things I miss about living out there. Yeah.
The architecture of Chicago is having such a kind of impact on your work, and sounds like it was a very good starting point. I have to imagine to some degree the work you're doing has changed based on the setting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that architecture, the like kind of ecstatic architecture, was a great starting point, but it changes as I change, and like I think with the past series I did, I had realized I'm like, oh, it's like that like 7-year point where like most of the cells in your body have replaced themselves. And I'm like, I'm a whole new painter now.
I'm like technically a different person.
Yeah, technically a different person, but also like being out in that environment, it changes what I paint and changes like I don't think I can shake these architectural elements just yet, but they're definitely becoming more like landscapey, or there's weirder stuff coming in, and there's more bodily stuff coming in to them. Like it's
So you're saying that like from the stuff you've done in the past, there's a place to go that is weirder and more bodily, and you're heading in that direction?
I'm trying to. I don't know. Look out. I'm going to be like a biomech artist pretty soon. Yeah, I don't know. I think I can get really in the groove of like doing a series of paintings, and then when it's over, I'm like, oh, there's time to like shift, and just trying to remind myself constantly that like, I don't know, I'll always draw how I draw and paint how I paint. It's possible to like constantly branch out on what a painting encompasses or what's in a painting.
Do you feel that the outside world has an impact? I mean, you said, you explained the way in which it affects Gaylord Phoenix, but do you think that like what's going on right now with the world is having a direct impact on everything?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that probably wasn't the most mic-friendly noise, that little screech, but that's a weird question, because of course everything...
Sure. It affects you personally, and obviously that filters down to the work, but I mean, is there kind of a direct connection between the two?
Yes. But I also feel like as the world gets more digitally and more digital dependent, like like reality is very fused with like the world that's online in this weird way. And I feel like more and more I'm taking the little paths to kind of opt out of a lot of internet platforms. And I don't know, part of that I do just for my mental health. Like I want to stay omnivorous and stay engaged, but a lot of it feels like, I don't know, algorithmic manipulation. Yeah. That isn't
Facebook.
That's not cute to me. That's like, that just seems like capitalism, like gone dystopian, like it just feels like dystopian capitalism, which is already dystopian enough. Like so I think that in a lot of ways, like I don't spend a lot of time online, and I'm not exactly always interested in what's happening online. And that's a big part of what's happening in the world, though, is like, so I don't know. There's, I guess, a this and that. Like, it's hard to take it all in.
Yeah. And your work is obviously, mostly physical. You obviously come from like zine and mini comics culture. Yeah. You're making paintings.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel my best when I'm working with my hands, and I think the most clearest when I work with my hands. So like, I think, like I can't imagine, I know plenty of people who do beautiful work on computer and via tablet, but I don't enjoy it working with computers. So I tend to stay away from it. Yeah. I also like, I went down this kind of like rabbit hole in my mind of like thinking about the idea of like a non-binary thing. And I'm like, oh, like digital languages are all premised on binary, and what language that produces can always be reduced to the binaries of 1 and 0s. Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, it's at the point, like maybe I'm not the most creative, but I can't imagine like a way to produce like a non-digital system that does the same thing that those digital systems, like that computers do, where I'm like, oh, it does that, but it can't accept paradox in this way. And which I feel like a paradoxical state of living is part of trans and non-binary identities. But to get to the reality of that, it almost requires new language in some way.
What was the experience like putting the collection together for Secret Acres?
The Little Stranger?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was funny. I mean, at first, I was working with Leon from Secret Acres, and I was like, he had proposed the book, and I was like, oh, that sounds good, but I don't think there's that much work. And then it turned out,
like, you don't think I can fill up a book with
I don't
what
think
I have?
I can fill up a book. Or like,
it's so funny because like I see your stuff like every time I go to like a shop, every time I'm at like Needles and Pens, and like, oh, there's a new mini comic from you, it seems like.
Yeah, but they're all, I mean, like, it was the idea of like doing like small stories and minis, and like it I do them with plenty of spacing in between them, so it definitely was like the feeling of like, I don't know if like, but yeah, you keep making things for a few years and you'll fill up a book pretty fast. So it was exciting to see that there was a body of work to start with. And then, it was also interesting to see, I was worried that it was going to be pretty disorganized, and the stories in it are weird, but there's like these connecting threads that roll through it. And I think the book is kind of anchored by this series of comics in the middle of it where I started drawing myself. Like, I was responding to a question I got asked a lot about Gaylord. Like, are you the Gaylord? Who's the Gaylord? Or like, who are you in this?
Who's the Gaylord?
Who's the Gaylord in this? Yeah. Yeah, it was, as a response to that, I was like, oh, I'll just start like drawing myself in like the same, not the same kind of fantasy comics, but like also make fantasy comics, but I'm a character in it. And so the book has like this center section where I'm like a character who moves through these kind of fantastical settings and encounters weird events. And that's where that comes from. And I feel like that's kind of the heart of the Little Stranger book. And then there's like kind of zines and experimental comics that are also included in it too.
What was that experience like, putting yourself in a story?
At first it was totally like harrowing. Like, I mean, I feel like there was like, I was doing like...
Because, I mean, you get to choose how much of yourself you put on the page.
Right. And I think I didn't want to do something where I was in the comic and it was straight up autobio comics.
Sure. Not like a diary comic.
I mean, I try to live an interesting life, maybe a life that someone would want to read about, but when I try to write it down, like every time I've tried to journal or like tell the truth about like what happened, the words seemed to fall short of my experience of it. I was like, oh, but when I lived it, it felt a little more exciting than when I'm writing it down. It seems a little more petty. And I actually like, you know, I've never kept a consistent journal because I don't like how it seems like it shortchanges my memory in this way. But I did want to use myself as a character and then extend the weirdness of the world around me. And that actually, like, it felt good. Like, sometimes I feel like there's a lot of me getting into kind of, like, these sexual situations in the book, and that I definitely, like, when I would put that in a zine out in the world or something, it was always, I was like, what am I doing? And, like, I'm not a big exhibitionist or anything, but it felt a little like...
So these were based on things that had happened to you?
You know, I think the thing is that they're not. You know, like, they're based on... maybe the emotional weight of things that have happened to me.
Somebody's like, are you this character? And you're like, no, but I will put myself in a book, but it will be myself, but in a completely fantastical setting. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, it does something that's useful and also something that I don't quite know how to explain what it does for me, but it seems to, if I put myself in almost like a body terror story or something, it seems to almost, what's the word? Exercise something.
Yeah.
From my psyche.
Yeah. What do you mean with body terror?
I mean, like, there's one story in the book where I, like, my body's kind of, like, overcome by these, like, sex parasites.
That kind of body terror.
Yeah, like, that kind of body terror, you know? Like, so there's that, but there's also, like, comics about vulnerability, and there's, like, comics about, like, falling to pieces. Like, there's... And it's softly done, you know, like, I don't think I draw in a very gruesome way at all. Like, it's all, like, soft edges on it, but there's stuff that it's hard to think, but, like, something, like, psychically clicks when I'm, like, writing out what's going to happen in a story, and, like, I'm like, oh, that feels like there's something true, and that it didn't happen to me. My body wasn't overcome by parasites or anything yet, but, you know, maybe in the next few years.
Desert parasites.
Yeah. Absolutely. But writing about it felt like true to some things experientially. Yeah.
Do you feel like you learn about yourself and your work when you kind of go back when it's time to not only do a compilation, because like you said, it wasn't just putting a bunch of stuff together chronologically, but it was figuring out how everything fit together. It was figuring out, you know, sort of larger narratives, like linear threads throughout your life. Like, surely that must have shed some interesting light on both you and your work.
One thing that was interesting was that the book isn't chronological at all, and it just felt like... So it was interesting to kind of create it almost like a waveform or something, where I was like, oh, like, these themes kind of like echo through the book, and maybe they kind of deepen as they're kind of reiterated.
Did you find anything surprising that you know, hadn't realized either when you created the work or put it out initially?
I think that Little Stranger is a pretty funny book, and it won't make you, like, laugh out loud, but I think, like, I was surprised. I was like, oh, I'm maybe funnier than I thought I was I didn't write any of them trying to be funny, but I think some of them turned out that, or like together they turned out that way, where I'm like, oh, and then also, yeah, I don't know, it was interesting to kind of, I don't have a good, for all me saying that, like, journaling, like, shortchanges my memory, I don't have a great memory either. So part of it, putting it together, was like remembering what was going on at each time of things happening, and kind of like actually like building, like, I was like, oh, like, I've lived in a bunch of cities, and like I'd be like, oh, this like place and time in my life really shaped this story, but then also like I'm still dealing with that stuff from this like other place. So these threads, like the threads that connected are like, there's like long-standing, like, of course there's like long-standing like trans identity shit that rolls through it, and there's, I don't know, like fixations with different things. And also like kind of like a kitschy like Halloween aspect to all of it, which is my like life aesthetic in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of a truism about life. I definitely thought when I got to this point in my life that I would have a lot more of my shit figured out. That like I don't, not like I think I'm a pretty like reasonable person, and I think I do have most of my stuff together now, but something will come along and you'll just be like, yeah, I guess I didn't quite process that, or I'm not quite over that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a big message that I got out of the book, is like still processing. Yeah. And I think, I don't know, maybe that's lifelong or whatever. Like part of it was like also like, like a little bit like throwing my hands up and like be like, where did all this come from? Yeah. So
maybe that's part of transitioning too. I mean, you just kind of assume that like you transition and does end up being kind of a lifelong thing.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, especially like for me, I've been like a kind of a weird, queer, weirdo, non-binary person for a long time, and not, like identifying as trans, but not necessarily like passing in society.
The name Edie, like, right? I mean, it's traditionally a feminine name.
Yep. And but it also feels like such a good fit. Like, I don't think I'd ever like try to masculinize it. Like, I don't feel like
you're not gonna throw another D in there.
I don't feel like an Eddie. Like it just. And I do feel like an Edie, so I think it's, in terms of like a chosen name, I don't think I could have chosen a better one for myself, so.
Do you feel like you have yourself pretty figured out at this point in your life?
Gosh, like the minute I say yes to that, I'll get knocked down by another like Saturn return or something. Yeah. I don't know, do you feel like you have yourself figured out?
Some days.
Yeah.
Generally know who I am. I don't know that I necessarily know what I want or my place in the world.
Yeah.
But I do feel like I've been like living with this for long enough that like I have a general idea of who I am.
Yeah. I think I have a constantly deepening understanding of my like skill set, both as a person and like technically. And that helps me like understand like what I can be most effective at doing in the world, and like also things I'd like to try.
It does sound like a big part of your work generally is pushing yourself both aesthetically and in terms of storytelling. To try new things, to not get bored.
Yeah, and also, like, I think in, like, how I live, to, like, not trying to live a life that I'm proud of, too, in general. Like, not just through the work, but, like, I don't know, in what I do, so.
Again, when you were putting the book together, were you able to at least kind of have that moment where you're like, I'm pretty good at this?
I guess, or, like, I
don't suck.
I mean, I will say, like, I don't, like, my drawing style for comics isn't my favorite drawing style out there, but I don't think I could. It feels like it almost draws itself in this exciting way. Yeah. And so when it does that, like, I'm like, oh yeah, it is like saying something that like, like it doesn't have to be the best drawing in the world to be a comic that I'm proud of, or like to say something that I think is true and deserves to be said.
I assume, especially when you're working on longer forms stuff, there must be points where you feel like you're forcing it, but the art comes pretty naturally to you.
Absolutely. Yeah. That just flows, and when it doesn't, then I usually switch gears because it seems like something is off, like whether it feels like like I feel like I'll be very attracted to something and get pretty far along in a project, and I'll be like, wait, this feels like almost like style biting or something, and like kind of like give it the axe, because it starts getting clunkier and clunkier to draw because it's kind of like out of my flow, I guess.
But you're able to leave and come back.
I could leave and come back, or I could just leave. There's projects I just leave because they're not effective, But the process of doing it isn't a waste. Like, it gets you somewhere and it gets you to understand. Like, but not everybody. I mean, like, everybody doesn't get to see everything I do. That's just like the nature of the beast.
There you go. That was Edie Fake. Recorded that one when he was in town a few months back for MoCCA. You can check out a fantastic collection of his work called Little Stranger, out now on Secret Acres. Thanks so much to him for taking the time to do that. Thanks to you guys, as always, for listening to the program. If you like the show, there are a number of ways to support us. You can rate and review us on iTunes, Google Podcasts. We're on Spotify and YouTube now. If you have any feedback, it's irwellcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Tumblr. That's irwellcast.tumblr.com. Like us on Facebook, and that's about all we got for this week, so stick around because we're going to be back at just about this time next week with another episode of RIYL.